a bit of a maybe more optimistic viewpoint in presentation 1, and a bit more of a gloomy vision in presentation 2, I would say, but there are definitely many points of contact. Some of the things that you are saying, when you describe, it's always interesting to me, whenever we listen to this kind of, analysis where, our bedroom has become our university. Said today, it is presented as a critique of a problem, basically, sort of identifying there's a problem in there. The same words stated 50 years ago were taken as a hope, like the bedroom should become our university. So that somehow is nice that, it connects back to how I started this morning when I was showing some of the things from just a couple of slides relating back to the 60s and these ideas of the university explodes, should go outside of the campus and so on and so forth, was exactly why not our bedroom becoming part of the university? Why not taking advantage of new technologies? At the time, of course, in which Zoom didn't exist and anything of that existed. One other thing that I could have put on in there is the obvious reference, perhaps coming from here in an architectural context, which is the work of the architect Cedric Price, that non-architects might not know who he was, but he was definitely one of those very harsh critics of his own discipline somehow. And he reflected quite a bit about what a university is, and he edited an issue of an important magazine of architecture, architectural design, and the title was "What About Learning?" And the cover page of the magazine did not show any architecture at all. Didn't show buildings, didn't show anything that is properly architecture, but it showed a hand with a watch. So that's what was on the cover, and the point was exactly, maybe the university is this now. Okay, so now it looks like hopes have turned into a nightmare.
Yeah, I think they have. I think that's why everyone's exhausted, and I think that's why it affects people's well-being. And I think the emotional, mental stresses of these things are the things that everyone's trying to recoup strategies. Today's presentations for me were uplifting, and very generational aspirations of solving these problems. The issue is the amount of work we do and where that's happening, and the fact that we have to keep working to meet these economic imperatives. The whole of these sessions have been about the problems of property development, that completely uncontrolled neoliberal market of property development. Mm-hmm. And as it just keeps going up without any governmental control, this thing is something that we're all trying to negotiate. It is not sustainable that most people who live and work in London can no longer live in London. It is a mad environment. So I think it is doom and gloom, because I think at some point there has to be a reflection, a revisitation, a contestation of it. It's fine to have the expanded university in the bedroom if it's intellectual and off and on, but it's not off and on anymore. Mm-hmm. It's always on, isn't it? Yeah. That's the problem.
Of course.
Yeah. Yes. But you might want to add more. I'm not sure.
No, I think that this kind of idea of countercultural ideas and then getting subsumed and capitalized on, I think it's probably, it's really interesting to think about, because even cooperatives, thinking about cooperatives which were founded in, we briefly talked about this in the break as well, cooperatives which were founded in the 60s, 70s, they're quite rich at the moment, and they have this huge reserves and pots of money, but and some of them are investing and are managing this capital in a way that's according to not growth, but others probably aren't. So it's so I think that's that question of taking something that is outside of this kind of culture and then adopting it and subsuming it comes over and over again, and it's something that probably will continue to be there. Mm-hmm. yeah.
How do you think what you propose as what you call the coalitional architect? You touched. I mean, you mentioned, of course, that there's an education issue in there. So what about architectural education, basically, in that? Do you see anything that is going in the direction? I mean, you said there is no housing as common is not yet there, but housing as commoning is somehow happening. Do you think the formation of a coalitional architect is somehow happening in architecture schools? Have you seen examples of that? Or is it something that you mentioned, something that you are doing yourself right now? Is what you are trying to achieve?
Actually, this event today is in a way demonstrating that something is happening, because I really like this part of the abstract we spoke about earlier, that students are actually are experiencing the neoliberalization of education and the housing market. So it's this kind of double precarity. So I think that this position that they're entering the profession and the experience and the embodiment of this experience is going to really reflect on the type of practitioners they're going to become.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that carving out spaces in education where they can think outside of this, outside of the neoliberal university, but also outside of the role of the neoliberal architect is very, very important, because then they have the tools to, the toolbox to resort to when they're outside of the university.
Ija, in the lunch break, I think we were discussing, you were asking, you were saying actually, this is great to see that so much happening. I wonder, shouldn't this be somehow helped by the universities? Okay, and we were discussing is, and this is where maybe I could also start opening it up generally, and I wouldn't actually in particular maybe to listen also to what Anke might have to say from the point of view of an academic professor teaching, trying to researching these things, how you approach them from an academic, from a scholar point of view, but more generally also you mentioned very clearly in your presentation there's no way cooperatives can be top down, so it has to be a bottom up thing. So I think it's on the one level we would imagine, and that's also where I would like to hear everyone's ideas in there, that to set up the co-op in Manchester would be great if the University of Manchester were to help. But then I also raise a question mark. Is that so or not? Are you setting yourself against that? Are you setting against this field that looks like it's so gloomy and so corrupt, there's no way of turning it, and so maybe it's just better to keep the university out of the picture and just be completely autonomous?
Well, it was after the first session that I had a chat about it, because I was saying universities, the budgets are massive, aren't they? They're just huge. Once you see the spreadsheet, it's just phenomenal how much money moves through a university. So the buying of property by universities is just a big part of Vice-Chancellor's conversations. The selling of property, the purchase of property, the expansion of campuses, it is a fundamental part. But the access that universities have to capital for housing is huge. Mm-hmm. It's huge. But the way that they've set it up is that it is not accessible. So if you have a developer work on a project, they have a commitment to produce affordable housing. No university is asked to produce affordable housing. It just is a completely uncontrolled market. But I think in listening to the speakers talk about how are they purchasing money, for somebody to buy a house in Cork, for a university to buy a house in Cork, £700,000, drop in the ocean. And if that money that they were using was to do something that was better, or a better housing model that offered something else, that would be ideal, because they've got the capacity to get access to that capital. Whether or not it's dancing with your enemy, I don't know, but I feel like in England, if you're at the bottom, I write a lot about cumulative disadvantage that it builds up, and somehow you've got to kind of crack it to make the mainstream more, rather than the subculture, it needs to become more mainstream. So if there's a way to do that that's still ethically decent, then that would be a proposal. But I'm happy for other people to also give their comments on that, because that may be madness.
Yeah, yes, we have a microphone here. If you want, you just pass it on.
On a personal note, I think I would be very readily for my university to start funding some socially valuable things instead of partnering with deeply, unethical businesses. So it might be dancing with the devil for now. It might be a compromise. But at the end of the day, it is our university because we pay for it. We can't expect it to be like a negative force that can't be, negated with. And as you said, they are a powerful institution that can get us onto a property ladder. So even if that allows, even if it's a springboard for more autonomous ways of living, then I think that would be personally very welcomed. I'm not sure about everyone else. Would you partner with your uni?
Yes.
Yeah? Oh, okay.
Anke has a...
Yeah, I've got a whole bunch of things to say, but I'll keep it short. We've got two really contrasting stories because when Edinburgh and Birmingham both opened 10 years ago, in Edinburgh there was a ton of support from the rector, the university. Birmingham was completely different. They were in a very adversarial relationship. They had Defend Birmingham a year earlier, which had occupations and legal action against students, and a lot of the co-founders were involved, so they had no support from the university whatsoever. So, both of this. But even though I think it's a grassroots effort, they can't do it without supporting institutions. It's not just finance, it's legitimacy, it's credibility that's coming. The other thing that's come up a lot is the role of the NUS, the National Union of Students, and their resources, and why they have never supported student cooperatives on a big scale. And then something you said that's also come up in my interviews is the established general housing co-ops that are sitting on a lot of equity and capital, and where are they in the picture of supporting emerging co-ops, including student housing co-ops. So there's a whole bunch of resources that could be activated, and part of it is that the story of student housing co-ops just hasn't been told yet. It's just not out in the open, and events like this one, I think, can contribute to broadcasting this. I was also going to say we're actually working on a publication, a 10th year anniversary publication, kind of to showing the success of the movement so far. So that will be part of making that much more widely visible and available. I'll keep it at that.
Could I just ask a question? The morning panel, I was thinking, if all the cooperatives could work together as a collective, what kind of action would they have rather than work independently? Do you work together, or do you work independently in your cities? Do you ever work together on the same problems?
There are cooperative models that you can go to get advice in North America and in the UK as well.
But working together on the same issues and then using that collective action for change, is that something that happens?
Student Homes is trying to do that. I don't know if you listened to Lisa's presentation.
Yeah, I
think that's one kind of umbrella organization that is trying to create collective action to some extent and pull resources and knowledge and get access to finance.
From all the cities.
And even Student Cooperative Homes goes to America and gets resources there and connects sort of spreads.
And does that go then to institutions and governance to, where's the action being taken to demand for change? Because that's the interesting question, isn't it, as a collective, whether or not it's with student unions or within the cooperatives themselves, where does that action get implemented or taken?
At the moment, it's individual co-ops. The 10 groups, some housed, some unhoused. That's where the action ultimately happens, on the ground in individual universities. Yeah.
I think we all have an interest to network as well. It's just a matter of capacities and generalising our aims over the differential interest that we have in different cities, because the markets are very different as well. But yeah, I have a question. Sorry, for your presentation, could you elaborate on the varied vulnerabilities that the community land trusts versus the social housing have towards privatisation? Because at one point you said the social housing model in Britain is quite open to being privatised, as it was in the 80s, I guess.
Yes, it was. Yes, just because based on the history of it being the decision-making power being so focused on in the public sector, it just takes one decision on national level to actually privatize the stock. While if you have a more distributed model, it's trickier to redevelop and privatize it. And there are community-led projects in London. For example, the Seven Sisters Market, the way that it was set up was, again, having this kind of a very distributed model where the vendors were involved, the local authorities were involved. So I think these are agreements that are so much more complex, but also so much more difficult to do anything with them in terms of with the community asset, in terms of privatizing or redeveloping it. So yeah.
Do you have a question?
Yes,
Sorry.
I think also it makes me think about like Thomas's, when he talked about universities looking at students as just a way to make profit, I think it extends to even housing and a lot of other things. And your presentation also made me think about the Jane Jacobs. She wrote an essay on credentialing and education, and the idea that universities are much more about giving, like there's two parts. It's about educating people, but it's also about giving this credential. And I think we're starting to see that it's becoming more and more about the credential than the actual education, because education is so readily available and it's so openly available in the world. And I mean, even the idea of Rochdale, which was this free university, I think we're there. We don't really need a university for education. And so universities are really about the credential and like marketing and big buildings and famous buildings. And I guess wanted to ask, where do you see the future of this going? Is it in that direction? Does the university become irrelevant at some point? Or do they shift?
I think
That's a great question.
it is a good question. What would be my dream would be if everything was de-accredited, because the accreditation boards kill you. They're just strangling you. And the audit culture is phenomenal. It's so unbelievable at levels that audit culture of students and the processing and all of that. I think so if you could dismantle all of that and actually slow things down, and I think also return to questions of the collective. I don't think there's enough about the collective mindset in universities. A lot of it's about kind of personal development, and I think everybody in this room is collectively centered. But there's a lot of the world being taught in universities to not be like that. And I think those two things would be quite vital. So one is almost like a dismantling of the audit culture, which would be going backwards, people might argue, but I think that would give you breathing space. It would take pressure off everyone. It would allow people to enjoy learning. They might, all the mental health issues we have with everybody working in a university, I think those things have come out of all of that culture. So if we're going to get some kind of betterment in how we live, I think that would need to go backwards.
Exactly on this point, because right now I'm in a peculiar position of being a teacher and a student at the same time because of the PhD. So I kind of try to think about, and to me there is something about all the experiences that we witness today that actually answer your question a little bit, your point. That is, yes, we can access knowledge easily, but knowing something is different than experiencing it and embodying it. You could read so many articles online or have meetings online about how to share a home, but sharing it is a different thing. Building something together is a different thing. And I do believe still that there is that value in education. And that's why I agree with the idea of if we could get rid of this. And in a way, there is something interesting about almost going back to the very first universities, right? I mean, at least in the European context, like Bologna or Cambridge, where actually were first and foremost places where to live. And therefore that living together was experiencing something and therefore learning something. And I wonder if we can, because something I kept thinking about today during the presentation is, what about the people who actually left the cooperative houses? Because maybe it's not for everyone, but maybe those students were there for 6 months, they learned a lot out of that experience. There is still something that is being given and is being received in that process. And maybe there is something to say about what if we reframe this whole process as a value in its own way, as an educational value, either if it's housing or if it's the educational part, the more kind of formal part. But I think maybe that's where we can start to kind of challenge the neoliberal paradigm, which is scary because in a way, if we give value to something, we construct that value, we are kind of giving something else to be sold, right? So it's I don't know where to. It's a kind of, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're touching upon a point that I also been reflecting a lot. And I mean, I'm wondering what is, of course, the limit of dream somehow, or the limit of ambition or provocation somehow in what you're all trying to do. Of course, I fully understand, and it's clear, as you stated this morning, when we were discussing, and I think May, you were saying, what I really need is someone to let me know how to get rid of a piece of plasterboard. So it's really something very tangible. I need simple help. I need those things. At the same time, however, again, connecting back maybe to those earlier generations that they were a bit more of a pain in the ass, perhaps, to the system overall. I wonder what is the greater ambition. So, for instance, if we were to relate to what Abby was showing, the beginnings of the Toronto experiment that very gradually ended up in having a very bad reputation and all that. But would you be willing as a generation to say we shouldn't just stop at getting a 7-bedroom house? Would you be willing at sort of trying to create your own entire institution, just like that was not only a place to live, but was somehow its own university, its own place where learning and living takes place, which of course is a bit dancing with the devil because you are working from within the very problem that you're trying to respond to somehow. So you're creating either a fantastic thing that might last as any radical project very little, or you're creating an incredible nightmare that will collapse in a second you just want to get out of. But I just leave that as a sort of open provocation to someone who's a bit younger than me.
I have multiple thoughts on this. Firstly, my initial reaction to what you're suggesting about a more radical movement, such as what happened in Toronto, is, as an activist involved in multiple causes, the risk of criminalization can be so high for things that don't even feel like a particularly radical demand. It shouldn't be radical to have somewhere safe and clean and healthy to live. Yet it is. The universities, it can feel like they almost don't want us to have this. They want to keep us desperate and they want to keep us in need because then they can sell us their things. So all of these dreams of a more radical world, I think for me, fuel the movement, but it also starts with a concrete place to live, as in our activism needs a base. And if that is the 7-bedroom house that we have, that's fine for now, but we should never lose sight of the bigger movement. And something that will probably be the future of my academic research, if I go on to do my PhD, will be an idea that I have right now. There's probably better ways for me to explain it, but this is just my initial thoughts on it. Or like academic references I may make in the future, but right now this is just my own thoughts that I will say in another academic's words. For me, I think cooperatives can be the basis for more possible worlds of radical change inside of the bigger superstructure, because I don't think neoliberalism is going to dissolve on its own, or at least not in our lifetime. So what we need to do is make small bubbles of positive change, which may be several bedroom houses in a city, that form networks that help each other, because we can't change this overnight, but we need somewhere to live now so that we can keep fighting for change. And I think there are definitely pitfalls to reformism, and that's not what I'm trying to advocate for. But if I could, I would squat buildings, but I can't without getting arrested and having all of these changes that I could make in the future taken away from me. And this goes for the wider movement. And yeah, I think we can have these radical dreams, but we also need a place to dream, which would be the cooperative houses that we can build now.
Really just add to that, I think these spaces are ideologically different from the rest of the world. And I feel like with Neo-Isaac, for example, they are spending months trying to figure out how to increase the rent by $22. And it's like, they're like, how are we going to do it? Are people going to agree to this? We need to get everyone to agree. And when I hear them, like, rents in the rest of the world are going up by hundreds and hundreds of dollars, like every month. But the space itself is still, that's what the world should be, is that we should really be thinking, is it worth it to increase our rent by $20, $22, $23 this year, because we need it. And I think that even looking at the Edinburgh co-ops that inspire students to graduate and then build more co-ops, I think those are spaces that are ideologically different and set apart from the rest of the world, which is really special.
Do we have any maybe final question? And yes, Oscar.
Okay, it's a final one. So much pressure. No, I was wondering, is it really enough to have all of these happy pockets in society, or do you, as cooperatives, see yourself as kind of responsible for like somehow also getting back to society and bringing that change back into society? And how do you actually create that connection? How do you feed back all that challenging kind of ideology that you're talking about?
That's a lot of responsibility.
Yes.
I always think we always kind of look at younger generations and go, how are you going to do that massive job? It's just, how are you going to solve the climate crisis? We just ask such things. Anyway, it'd be good to get the answer.
Do you think about them? I think that's already big enough.
Yeah, it's a great question.
Do you think about feeding back your knowledge? I think I'm not asking you to, teach the entire society how to do that. I'm just saying, is that one of the cooperative's concerns? Is the cooperative concerned with feeding back?
Do you?
I think yes, and we talked earlier today about there's a tension between looking inwards and making sure that the cooperative functions well between a group of people, and how do we care for ourselves and resist the detrimental pressures of the outside world, but also how do we look outwards and give back to our community. So in Glasgow, we've been having a lot of discussion about different neighbourhoods that we want to live in, ideally, depending on what the housing market can provide us, and talking about how do we actually give back to this community and we don't just end up as an insular little group of students living together. How do we form a dialogue and also contest the reputation that students have that we are just a transient population that's only concerned with ourselves in the next couple of years? Because I think everybody here today probably doesn't think that, and we see being a student as an important function of society. There are millions of students in the UK, and we are not just transient. We will make lasting impacts, and we will take the country and different industries in different directions. And on knowledge sharing as well, and going back to earlier questions, I think cooperatives do definitely support each other, but there is a tension between supporting each other and we also end up, in some ways, indirectly competing with each other, like with student cooperative homes. Under their model, all of the different cooperatives are funded by a central pool of their money. Some cooperatives have slightly different funding structures, such as Glasgow has a loan from Scotland Cooperative, but we also depend on that pool of money from student cooperative homes. And whenever one of the cities gets a building, it means that the other cities looking at buildings have less to work with. even though we are trying to support each other and build the cooperative movement as a social thing. So yeah, the social goal is definitely limited by the funding that we have at the moment. I hope that can change.
Thanks, mate. That's a very nice way of concluding. So that, I think, is the end of the day. It's been a very long day. Thank you, everyone, for your presentations. It was great discussions. We are continuing tomorrow for all of you who are coming. It's going to be a bit more of a hands-on discussion, maybe around some drawings and around some spaces and architecture in some way. The meeting tomorrow, we start at 10:30 tomorrow. We can discuss all of these maybe upstairs. If you are not too fed up of staying in this building, you might be fed up of staying in this room, so I can show you some other spaces in the school as well. There's a nice bar upstairs, there's a nice terrace. Maybe we can hang out a little bit there and then discuss for tomorrow. But thank you, everyone, for today.
Thank you.